Morning, everybody, and welcome to this Refinitiv webinar in partnership with ASIFMA and dedicated to the FX Global Code and how we believe it can help shaping a better financial market and a better foreign exchange market. My name is Vincenzo Di Mase, Vince, Market Development Director for Trading at Refinitiv, and today I will be hosting this session with the precious contribution of some great speakers. Anjes Chichonga, Manager of the FX Trading at the South African Reserve Bank, David Woolcock, Chair of the ASIFMA Committee for Professionalism and member of the Global FX Committee Disclosure Working Group, Svante Hedin, Global Head of FX and Commodities at SEP, and Richard Roos, Head of FX at Standard Bank, but also Deputy Chair of the South African FX Committee. At the same time, myself, I will be wearing an additional hat as a speaker for a few minutes to share with you the Refinitiv experience on the FX Global Code project. Together, we would like to provide you with an update on the FX Global Code and its benefits, sharing the experience gained on the ground and providing you with an overview on adherence process and the steps and the tools required to embed FX Global Code in your operations. On this ground, our speakers will share their experience and views on such a project. Now, before we start, let's do some housekeeping, and I would like to remind you how to leverage these webinar tools. So please use the widget at the bottom of the page to discover the several functionalities available. As you may have noted, all phones are muted to allow a better flow. Along the session, you can submit questions using the Q&A chat box. We will be monitoring this chat and handle all the questions at the very end of this webinar in the Q&A session. Also, during the webinar, you may be asked to answer some simple questions using the interactive polling facility. So questions will pop up in your screen. As a reminder, today's slide deck and recording will be circulated soon after the webinar. Any question or technical issue you may have, click on the question mark and use the Q&A chat facility. We thank you in advance for filling a short pop-up survey at the very end of the webinar to get your kind feedback. So let's kick off the session, and I believe it's good to start from what the FX Global Code is. The FX Global Code can be simply described as a set of global principles of good practice in the foreign exchange market, developed to provide market participants with a common group of guidelines. It aims at promoting the integrity and the effective functioning of the wholesale foreign exchange market. Overall, I would say that the aim is to promote a market that is more robust, fair, liquid, open, and appropriately transparent. As you may know, despite the fact that we are all experiencing an increase of regulatory pressure across several jurisdictions, the Global Code does not impose any legal or regulatory obligations on market participants. Indeed, adherence to the code is done on a pure volunteer basis. And while not being a directive nor a regulation, it is nevertheless a great tool to update and review the full value chain in the FX operations and activities. The document is extremely simple and based on 6 leading principles covering ethics, governance, information sharing, execution, but also risk management and compliance, confirmation, and settlement. Again, the full value chain is covered by the 6 leading principles. Now, having in mind the diversity of the FX ecosystem, the code applies to all market participants, so buy side and sell side, corporate treasury department, banks, central banks, brokers, asset managers, and there are very few small exceptions. Think about retail as an example. Market participants can post their statement of commitment into a public register. There are 16 available as of today. And then the Global Foreign Exchange Committee hosts a global index of public registers, which is a nice website collecting the data from all public registers so that every counterparty can make their statements easily visible to all market participants, and everybody can easily check who has adhered or not. The FX Global Code is live since May 17, with the latest version updated on August 18. And yes, the FX Global Code, now available in 8 languages, it does replace the ACI Model Code. Now, before we kick off the discussion with our speakers after this small introduction, I think it's a good moment to ask the audience with a very, very simple question. So just take a few seconds to go through these. Just answer, and we will display the results in real time. So when it comes to the code, where do you stand on the FX Global Code adoption journey? My organization is currently reviewing its strategy in adopting the code. My organization has already adopted the FX Global Code, or my organization hasn't got a position yet on the FX Global Code. So just take a few seconds more, and I think we can now go and move into the results. Yeah. Okay, so it looks like we had or very few respondents, or there is a very common trend here. So it looks like still there is not a clear position on the FX Global Code so far. And with this in mind, and thanks for the ones who answered, I would like to start our discussion. And by the way, at any stage, if you have questions, please send via the Q&A chat box. So, Andres from SARB, what is your view on the FX Global Code, and what is the experience of SARB? Over to you, Andres.
Hello?
Yeah, Andres, please go on. All yours.
Hello, my name is Andres. First of all, thank you very much for inviting the Central Bank, the South African Reserve Bank, to be part of these initiatives. We feel honored to be contributing towards the promotion of the code. I think I will just go through the presentation. I will start by outlining the presentation itself, sharing the experiences of the South African Reserve Bank with regard to the leadership role that the Reserve Bank played in the formation of the South African Foreign Exchange Committee. Let me start by saying South Africa became a member of the Global Foreign Exchange Committee in May 2017, the date on which the Global Foreign Exchange Committee and the code was launched. Subsequent to that, the SARB, in consultation with the key FX market participants, endorsed the adoption of the FX Global Code and agreed to work towards promoting the foreign exchange practices in South Africa that are consistent with the principle outlined in the code. In preparing to establish a standalone foreign exchange committee, which was in line with the GFX expectations, the South African Reserve Bank formed the FX Working Group Committee. That was in January 2018. The objective of the FX Working Group Committee was to propose the terms of reference for the SAFEX committee and also to prepare its launch. It was at this committee that the recommendation was made that all members of the SAFEX committee have to endorse the code and publish their statement of commitment. At the same time, this was the time when the Reserve Bank was reviewing its FX business processes and practices and aligning them with the principle of the code. How we went about doing that, we identified the gaps and also looked at the action plans to fill the gaps. The next step was the implementation of those action plans to align the Reserve Bank's FX operations with the principle of the code. One of the initiatives that we took as a central bank was to review the central bank's code of conduct and rules for all the employees in the dealing room to make sure that that is aligned with the principle as outlined in the code. And another initiative was we developed a compulsory assessment test with the Reserve Bank Academy, which is our training institution, to conduct assessment tests on annual basis to make sure that the dealers or the staff working in the dealing room are always appraised about the principles of the FX Global Code. On the establishment of the SAFEX Committee, in short, the South African Foreign Exchange Committee was established on the 13th of March 2018, and under the leadership and the sponsorship of the Reserve Bank. It is a forum representing the key market participants in the FX market. It has about 14 members. Authorized dealers are represented. The Association for Saving and Investment is represented. The Association of Corporate Treasurers of South Africa, the Banking Association of South Africa, the Inter-Dealer Broker, the Security Exchanges. Broadly, all the key players in the domestic FX market are represented. Immediately after the committee was established, the Reserve Bank immediately endorsed the code and also published its statement of commitment. All other members of the SAFEX committee immediately committed themselves to endorsing the code and also indicated that they will be publishing their statement of commitment very soon. Progress in promoting the code, I'm happy to report that the South African Reserve Bank currently only conducts FX transactions with counterparties that have publicly endorsed the code through publishing their own statements. And going forward, all the FX counterparties that want to trade FX with the Reserve Bank, the condition is they must have endorsed the code and also published their statement of commitment. And the Reserve Bank is working hard with its partners within the SAFEX committee to engage other central banks within the region with the aim of creating public awareness about the code and also to encourage its endorsement. We are also engaging the buy side in the domestic FX market to create public awareness about the code. And lastly, the importance of adhering to the code, the Reserve Bank or the central banks view this as an opportunity to encourage a dialogue with the FX market participants to collectively agree and adhere voluntarily to principles of the code and market standards. And SAB's commitment in partnership with the FX market participants to work towards the promotion of the global best practice and processes in the domestic FX market. We also view this as an initiative to contribute towards the integrity and strengthening the effectiveness and the efficiency of the local wholesale FX market. Thank you very much. That is all from my side.
Yeah, many thanks, Andres, for your overview, which kind of underlines the role played by SARB in igniting that awareness and dialogue among market participants in the South African FX ecosystem to adhere to the code. And another important player to the code is indeed ASIFMA. So I would like now to hand over to David to get his perspective on the adherence process and how ASIFMA has contributed and is contributing to make this journey simpler. David, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you, and my thanks to Refinitiv for setting up the logistics today. So ACI have been intimately involved with codes of conduct for decades, and we were, the model code that came out with professionalism in around about 2000 was widely used by the market. Our previous codes, back in the 70s, have been widely used. We were one of the inputs into model code, one of the inputs into the FX Global Code, and ACI supported the FX Global Code right the way through. Once the FX Global Code was ready prior to the code, so we no longer updated, and all ACI members now FX Global Code. The way the system acts makes the national associations, and so it tries to change cooperation associations to promote state states to the code. Both in areas which don't get as much attention as they should. So Russia is one, say Russian version of model code, and they have now translated that to the code of Russia. And despite successful the needs of the good design. And it's very recent.
David, sorry if I interrupt you, but it looks like there is some sound issue, so we can hardly hear you. Let's do something. Let's try to reconnect. David, can you hear me well now? Can you try to speak now and see if it's back on a good quality?
Yes, I can hear you very well.
Yeah, please go ahead now. Looks much better.
Okay, sorry about that technical hitch. So as I was saying, ACI national associations have been very active in promoting the FX Global Code. Just recently, our chairman and director of education were in Africa, and we were very, very pleased to see a good response, good attendance, and a lot of interest in what we're doing. So if we go to the next slide, ACI's view on the FX Global Code is that a good part of it is education. And this is an area which we've always been very strong in. So our model code exam has now been also retired and replaced with an FX Global Code exam. And this gives the ability for banks to be able to, or any market participant, being able to take that examination, and it's a good base to show that you have a very good understanding of the code. If you look at the various surveys that have been done by the Global FX Committee, we saw a very, very strong message coming through that staff training and education programs were absolutely essential if you sign a statement of commitment and how you embed the code into your organization. And if we go to the next slide, it comes to something that is very close to ACI, is that once you've taken the exam, we felt that it was essential that, given that a code of conduct is a living document, our own model code used to get refreshed about every 2 years. The FX Global Code is going to be refreshed every 3 years. is it's very important that people keep on top of the code and can actually demonstrate ongoing adherence to the code. And to do that, we launched a product called ELAC, which is a continual training and development tool, which plays scenarios and is very good at covering the grey areas in the code. And you can put your staff through it and see how they're performing, both internally and, if you wish, externally benchmarked. So this ongoing training and certification, which does have CPD points available in many places, is where we think that a bank can continually monitor their staff and monitor their performance. And if we go to the next slide, so we're a leading example. Sorry, if we could go to the next slide. All right. So we've got a wide range of education tools for market ethical conduct and best practices. As I mentioned, the ELAC portal is the one that has been having a very large uptake. A lot of central banks are using it. A lot of banks are using it. And also we've now got a fair amount of the buy side using it. We've got the FX Global Code exam, which you can take anywhere, and which is, we're seeing a significant uptake in that. And where we are now concentrating our efforts is to reach out to places where the FX Global Code perhaps isn't as well understood as it is in some of the major centres. And equally, one of the key tasks now is to reach the buy side, to explain to them the benefits of them also signing a statement of commitment to the code, because what we strongly believe in is that if all market participants sign up to it, we will eventually achieve a very level playing field where everyone is behaving ethically and transparently one to the other. And with that, I'll pass back to you then.
Thank you very much, David. I think you touched some of the very key topics when it comes to education, training, paths, and the tools to test and certify people on the code. And more importantly, I also like the concept of the ongoing training activity, which reminds us that this is not a once-off exercise, but to be a continuous one. And before moving to the next session and see how banks have implemented their projects, let's ask the audience another quick question. Do you think that the FX Global Code is effective in contributing to a safer, transparent, and more efficient FX market on a long-term basis? What is your view? Is it highly effective? Is it somewhat effective? Or is it not at all effective? What do you think? Take 3-5 seconds more just to express your view on how do you think the FX Global Code is when it comes to being effective to make a better market on a long-term basis. So let's go now to the results and see what the audience has pushed through. And yeah, well, it's good to see that there is a 0 on the not at all effective, but again, the majority believes that there is a effectiveness in the code to contribute to a much better functioning FX market. Now, with that distribution in mind and with that idea in mind, I think we can move into the bank's experience. And I'm really curious to see what has been the experience of Seb and how Seb believes the code is key to the FX market and the FX operation. So, Svante, from your point of view, what's your take on this? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Vince. I hope you can all hear me and I'm coming through clearly. And I guess I'll begin to say I'm slightly encouraged by those poll results that we just saw. I think clearly there is a fair bit of interest in this, and hopefully we can meet some of the potential questions and considerations that may come up in adopting the code, seeing as that's clearly the focus here. Just a few very, very quick words about myself and the institution. So as you see on this slide, I'm currently based in Stockholm, working for SEB, where I'm globally responsible for the FX and the commodities business. SEB is a Nordic-based bank with a large corporate focus, although of course we've got a large institutional client base as well. And we are domiciled in the Nordics. We consider the Nordics and some parts of Europe as our core home markets, but we have significant presence also in the US and Asia, not so much in Africa as of yet. So we'll see where we end up there. But I'm going to skip forward now because we were and have been and continue to be very involved in the code, starting from the very beginning of drafting it in the first place. So we were one of the institutions in this so-called market participants group, where we looked at the very initial content of the code, and we work very closely with that group. We also work very closely with the Swedish central bank, the Riksbank, particularly on the examples sections, and basically gathering feedback on that, as well as sort of steering the whole process of putting the right examples against the most relevant principles, which was a pretty big undertaking. So it was pretty obvious for us that we would also sign the statement of commitment. We did that approximately 1 year after the formal release of the code, and I'm going to talk a few minutes around the process that took us there. Before I go there, though, I'll also come back to some of the obvious benefits that we see. But I'm mentioning already on this slide the alignment and the link into sustainable finance, and this is a point which I personally think is not necessarily considered enough in the market more broadly and as it relates to the code. What I mean with this is we see a crystal clear linkage between the FX Global Code and effectively ESG or ESG-related topics, i.e. environmental, social, and governance topics, which is at the very core of our institution and is very much a discussion point in the Nordics particularly, but I think in the market more broadly. And we believe very strongly that companies that align with good principles of how they conduct business in an ethical and sustainable way are going to be more successful in the long term. So the code is a tool in that, and a very important one. Now, I'm skipping to the next slide. Yes, there we go. So in terms of what our journey, very much perhaps to some extent obvious, but we started with reviewing and comparing effectively the content of the code with our own internal processes, and did a gap analysis on that, and where we saw that there were not necessarily misalignment, but where there were a bit missing in our internal processes or in our documentation, we had a bit of work to backfill for some of that. We also obviously had to make sure that all our staff were trained sufficiently. We actually used the ACI and the ACI's tools to a very large extent for that, and that worked very well for us. There are obviously other ways of doing it, but that worked extremely well for us. And someone is skipping. I don't think that wasn't me doing that. I'm not sure that was on purpose. Here we go. Once we had done that, obviously also update the external documentation to clients in terms of disclosures, etc., and then finally put the statement of commitment up publicly on the public registers. And this was the process that took best part of a year, to be honest. And much of that, of course, related to the documentation and getting all the reviews and checks and balances in place for that. So I touched upon this a little bit. What do we see the benefits of the code? As an institution like ourselves, but also I think more broadly, we have found it a very good cross-reference to help us update and review our internal processes and procedures. And the code sets very clearly out best practice in many areas. Secondly, with respect to staff training, the code encapsulates effectively a lot of course, good practice and professionalism and expected conduct of staff and people in the market in various parts, be that in sales, trading, operations, or elsewhere. And honestly, this is a good manual for us and a good tool to drive education around that, particularly for new people that come into the market from outside. We like that it's principle-based and not prescriptive, and many institutions, including ourselves, are heavily burdened by other types of regulation that are coming into the market, including MiFID, etc. We find that the code actually pretty clearly explains the intent behind a lot of this much more specific regulation that comes out into the market. So for those reading and really understanding the code and therefore the intent of what a lot of the regulation is actually trying to achieve, can significantly simplify interpretation and implementation as well of regulation. And last but not least, I mentioned the link to sustainable finance and sustainability. Skipping ahead, just a few takeaways. I guess these are the major ones. We found that the examples were extremely useful, and I'm not. You heard me earlier saying that I've been involved in drafting it. I'm not speaking my own book here. It was very useful, and to make it a bit more concrete and to give our staff something more tangible to work with and to drive the discussion was very useful. And we did find that in a lot of those conversations, the areas that were perhaps the most, I wouldn't say controversial, but where we had the most discussion, also where we got the most questions, was particularly around information sharing and level of disclosures, i.e., what is it actually okay, or where do you draw the line when a client, in our case, a buy-side institution, is asking for information? Do you know what's happening in the market? Can you see who's doing what? Can you explain why this is moving in a certain way? And we are to provide color on that from the point of view where we can see at what level of detail can you share and what is appropriate and what is not. That was extremely, we had some pretty intense discussions around that. The point about implementation as well, that it's typically not a one-off. You need to consider how you're going to keep this alive in your institution going forward. And last but not least, I mentioned this already, but otherwise we found that our business practices were actually much in line. The big gaps were around documentation and disclosures, and then some fine-tuning on, as I said, level of disclosure and information sharing. And I'm very, very happy to take questions. I hope there will be some questions and discussion at the end, to the extent that we can fit within the time given. But I will stop there and perhaps come back later with any questions for discussion. Vince, I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks very much, Svante, and that was very clear indeed. And indeed, illustrative examples are very useful. I found it very useful. And yes, again, the information sharing is one of the leading principles, which is attracting more interest and question, I would say. And I have to say, I really liked your comments when it comes to the training paths for the young people. And please don't move the slides and the just going back to the point where we are. So, and although I have to say, I like very much your comments on the young people, and also on the sustainability of the project. And maybe we want to come back to that point later in our discussion. Now, let's stay focused on how banks have made their journey into the code, and just simply move the focus from one institution to the other, from SEB to Standard Bank. And Richard, besides your remit as a head of FX at Standard Bank, you're also a key member of the South African FX Committee. So we're interested to get your views and experience. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Vincent. Thank you for inviting us to share our experience thus far with the code, as well as the journey that we've taken to adhere to the code. As Andres mentioned earlier on, the first version of the code, after the first version of the code was completed in May 2017, the South African Reserve Bank endorsed the global code and then further required any market participants who deal directly with them as a counterparty to also endorse the code. We made a decision early in 2018 to make public our commitment to the code and then to embark on a project plan to facilitate the implementation of the code. And I just want to stop there for 1 minute for those of you who are not yet part of the code. I think there is and was initially some confusion around, do you only endorse the commitment to the code once you've adhered to the code, or do you announce your commitment to the code and then manage and project plan the gap between your signing of the commitment and reaching full adherence to the code? And it's definitely the latter which does apply. And we found that once we had put that to bed in the South African market, the project teams around all of the banks in the market were doing a similar gap analysis and making sure that they were able to meet the commitment they had made to adhering to the code. In the South African context, you can understand that the mixture of buy-side, sell-side participants to the code, as well as broker, dealers, intermediaries, etc., is quite diverse. And the understanding of the code and the implementation of the code in the South African market has different places in different participants. And I think later on, if I'm not mistaken, we will be talking about proportionality. So I think very importantly, when signing the commitment to the code and immediately adhering to all of the aspects of the code, or proportionately what is important to your participation in the market or your readiness, are two separate steps. If we go to the next slide, and just to take you through how we went about it, we reviewed the FX code, the GFX code against our practices. Now, what had happened in the South African market is that in 2016, when a number of market abuse controversies were reaching the headlines and getting attention globally, the South African Reserve Bank embarked on a broad review of the FX market and how it operates. During that review, a number of parallel requirements that eventually came out in the code were reviewed within the market, within the different compliance divisions within the banks, as well as the operating of the global markets businesses. So what we found is that when we got to reviewing the code, a number of the requirements or principles of the code had been addressed in some shape or form within our institution. We then immediately did a gap analysis to what we already had in place to what is required to meet adherence to the code, and the gap analysis and principles really showed out to us that the main areas of concern were around disclosure. I think by that point in time, a number of the principles within the code, without getting into technicalities, as I said earlier on, were broadly getting adhered to. But the meeting the exact adherence to the code, the main area of gap and work was around disclosing adherence to the code to the counterparties that you operate with. We then embarked on a process to remediate those identified gaps and put various teams in place from all stakeholders within the bank, and we project managed our adherence and remediation of those gaps to a point where we can fully adhere to our commitment to the code. It is very important to note that ongoing review, and as Svante mentioned it earlier on, this is a work in progress. We are coming up to the 3-year review of the code. There are new nuances that are unearthed every time there's a global FX committee. Different areas are discussed. So it's very important that any commitment to the code is seen as committing to a work in progress and consistently reviewing and keeping abreast with what the deliverables are required on the code as the world evolves. And I think importantly for the African market, how the application of the code addresses the nuances in the different markets across Africa based on the maturity of those markets, based on the liquidity of those markets, and based on the type of participants that act within those markets. Very importantly, to make sure that we continue to adhere to the code is the training side of things. We embarked on an initial awareness training program and have now included within our compulsory or mandatory compliance training a section on the Global FX Code, which all members of our team that are involved in parts of the principles of the code are required to complete. Also important to note from our institution, we are also in 18 countries across Africa, and while none of the countries outside of South Africa have committed to delivering under the code, it is certainly something that we continue to anticipate. We have a full outreach program, and where possible, we are making sure that we're socializing what we're doing in the South African market across all of our jurisdictions, as and where possible, depending, of course, on the nuances of those markets. If I go to the final slide and I look at our key learnings and takeaway, in general, we find even prior, as I said earlier on, there was marked pressure from our offshore counterparties to do so. So we got to a point not only with the Reserve Bank, but also with the counterparties that we act with in the international market to make sure that we have committed to the code. We've embarked on a similar course with all market counterparties that we deal with, whether they be on voice or whether they be liquidity providers into our various aggregators, that they show commitment to the code so that we can somehow influence the ecosystem that we work in to be within the principles of the code. We did find, as I said earlier on, we were certainly lagging with disclosures to clients, and I think that the disclosure part is under quite broad discussion and debate within the market in terms of how it is applied, and that is an area that certainly from an Africa point of view is going to require more attention going forward, given the fact that a market can go from liquid to illiquid very quickly, and how the code applies to illiquid markets and how it's interpreted in a liquid market can vary quite substantially and can have some effect on the type of disclosures that you put out to your counterparties. The code is continuing evolving, as I say, and our market participants through the SAFX committee is constantly reviewing the changes in the market, not only internationally driven through the Global FX Code, but certainly as far as the South African market is concerned and the peculiarities within that. And as I said earlier on, we're keeping a very close eye on what's happening in the Africa countries where we have jurisdiction as well. Staff training and real examples are, I think this training at this point in time is training light. I look forward to seeing training come forward in a more formal basis through associations such as the ACI, and look forward to see how they are going to formalize the training within the marketplace and within their jurisdictions. I think lastly, again, I just want to touch on proportionality and applicability of the code. I think it certainly is a discussion point in our market as we sit and do a gap analysis to the applicability of the code to the South African market and more broadly emerging markets. And as I said earlier on, as we roll that out further into our jurisdictions in the rest of Africa, I think we are going to find more and more nuanced views and interpretations around that, and to make sure that we are able to apply the code to its full extent without compromise, but at the same time making sure that we're addressing those nuances. Thank you.
Great, Richard. Very, very valid points. I really enjoy the matrix with activities completed or to be completed, which provides a nice framework if you want to the journey. The gap analysis is definitely the key moment when the organization really touches what needs to be done, or touches and realizes what needs to be slightly adjusted, because maybe you already have a framework in place, and like Svante mentioned before, you just need to adjust something. And similarly, you pointed out how some of the market participants pressed to get others to adhere, which confirms how global and interconnected our market is once again. Now, as anticipated in my short introduction, let me wear the hat of presenter for a couple of minutes to explain how we in Refinitiv have worked on the code and contributed to market awareness. The starting point is definitely that Refinitiv signed a statement of commitment already in November 17, and also we will take an active role for its development with membership or being members of the market participants group through the participation in regional FX committees. And more recently, we have Neil Penny, who is leading the FX proposition in Refinitiv, appointed co-vice chair of the Global Foreign Exchange Committee. And similarly, we committed to promoting the code to our clients and the wider industry. The partnership with the SIFMA and this webinar itself dedicated to the African community are good examples again. And what you can see there in the picture is just an extract from the Global Index of Public Registers. Please, let me try the slides, please. A quick extraction from the on the Global Index of Public Registers, where you can see, a counterparty is registered. In this case, is Refinitiv statement of commitment being available. Now, when it comes to what we have done, let's go through what we have put in place and what we've done at Refinitiv. Now, let's go step by step. Despite of what happens to last look, we offer both trading paradigms, so last look and non-last look, so that you can select the most appropriate in line with market conditions. We have implemented tools in our venues to detect and signal if any misconduct occurs. And also, when onboarding participants, we do our KYC checks for the venue, and actually we ask participants when they accept the rulebook to declare if they're aware, if they went through the FX Global Code. In line with the execution principles, we have invested in TCA tools, transaction cost analysis, to provide more business intelligence to the market. We'll cover this in a moment. And besides trading itself, we do believe post-trade plays a big role in the code. So what we can offer is our trade notification secure platform, which is widely used, named as TRTN, but also powerful record-keeping solutions for the post-trade, which are extensively used and now also available through a cloud logic, beside the classic deployed servers to store information. And to give you an example on execution, Principle 9 states how market participants acting as clients should regularly evaluate the execution that they receive. This translates into better scrutiny of the service that you receive as a client, which equals business intelligence and transaction cost analysis, and having more granularity and more view and understanding of the service you receive. And this is where we have invested with FXall to make sure this information, in line with the Principle 9, is made available to the counterparties. And if you have access to Icon, we are close to launch a page, hopefully next week, fully dedicated to the FX Global Code. You just need to type FX Global or FX Global Code in the search bar to access all the relevant information on the FX Global Code project, and also to get a clear indication of how our services and solutions can help you to both optimize your workflows, but also meet the FX Global Code principles. And similarly, there is an additional tab which offers you easy navigation into the code itself, but also into the SIFMA website and tools, including the ELAC, the e-learning attestation and certification portal. And actually, this was one of the questions we got in the Q&A chat so far. So this is one of the channels to open a straight connection into the website of ASIFMA and discover more about the ELAC, the tool provided by the association. Okay, now let me come back to my moderation role. And before going through the questions we have received online and myself asking some questions to the speakers, let's quickly recap. So we went through an overview of the FX Global Code, the role of the gentleman. Let me drive the presentation, thanks. So, Robin, can you please support me on this? I mean, yeah, I need to, people not to touch the arrows, please. So we went through the role of the SARD for the development and the awareness on the market of the FX Global Code. David helped us to go through how important education is, and through ELAC as a tool, and with the contribution of Svante and Richard, we saw how important it is to review the processes, the policies, do the gap analysis, and how training is relevant, basically, when you start to adopt into real life and bring to real life the code. A code which is not a regulation, is principle-based, and through the contribution of the banks, we went through the learnings of what they experienced and some of the benefits that are clearly coming out of the FX Global Code adherence and adoption. Now, if I can recap quickly what makes the Global Code unique, well, definitely, let's go through these 6 easy concepts. As we said, it's principle-based, so it is built on principles and not regulation. Because of these, it needs to be interpreted. So compared with directives and regulations, the code needs to be interpreted and applied to each market participant's characteristics and market. And then we have the proportionality concept, which was mentioned before. So market participants adopt the code in line with their level of engagement in the FX market and with the size and the complexity of their FX operations. And, definitely something that needs to be reminded always is that the FX Global Code is global, applies to all the FX market participants, buy side, sell side, everybody is impacted. And it cannot be differently, honestly, because of the nature of the market. It's a simple document. So if I can share my experience going through MiFID II and other regulations, this is just 78 pages. So it's written in clear and simple language, and it's relatively short and gives you also illustrative examples. And finally, last but not least, it evolves. The code has a precise schedule and rhythm to make sure it is regularly reviewed to capture all market requirements and changes. Now, before shooting some questions, let me ask the final one to the audience. Are you aware of what proportionality means to your organization? So just click a yes or no for you to declare your awareness of the proportionality concept when it comes to the FX Global Code adoption. So it's an easy one. It's a closed question, yes or no. Let's go through the results quickly. And then, yeah. So definitely there is awareness. So to be raised on the proportionality. So let me ask one quick question to my speakers, and then let's cover the questions we got online. Svante, so my question I'm directing to you, but others please feel free to join. What is proportionality? How did you experience proportionality in reality in your project?
Yeah, I mean it's a question that has come up a fair bit, and I guess the answer it was 50-50. So you can choose sort of glass half full or glass half empty. either way. That there's clearly a fair bit of uncertainty around this, and I would say, sort of taking a step back, there are two things that go very, very much hand in hand in terms of drafting this code. One being the fact that it's principle based, and one being this concept of proportionality. They're very much linked. And what I mean by that is the intent clearly of the code, has been mentioned already now a few times, is to make it the be-all, end-all, universally applicable code for anything foreign exchange related globally. That's the sort of, and that's a pretty ambitious scope. In order to be able to achieve that, of course, there needs to be some flexibility in built into the code itself. It can't be too prescriptive and getting into too much level of detail, because then it won't get it right in all contexts and all different types of scenarios and jurisdictions. Consequently, it's driven around principles as opposed to being too prescriptive. And equally, there are sections of the code that clearly would not apply to certain whole sectors of the market.
Yeah.
And consequently, that's what the intent is with this proportionality concept, that this is not prescriptive regulation or directives. These are principles and trying to set out best practice. And each institution that reads and interprets and tries to effectively adopt the code needs to make their own call as to how many of those principles apply to themselves in the course of their business operations, and in what way. That's effectively the gist of it. I think that works. Personally, I think that works alongside the fact that it's principle-based and not prescriptive and directive. But I do understand that this comes up a fair bit, so it probably is something that everyone needs to consider.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. And let's go through the questions. We got several questions, actually. Thanks for that, coming through the chat. The first one is possibly, maybe Richard, you can answer it. Who can become a member of the South African FX Committee? How does it work?
So the South African FX Committee, as Andy said earlier on, was constituted by the South African Reserve Bank. It has representatives on it by invitation to all sectors within the market, both buy side and sell side. As far as the sell side is concerned, it has a representative for the main authorized dealers. Those are the top 5 banks. It has a representative for the smaller authorized dealers, and then a representative for the international banks. And each of those sectors has a different body to speak for, and I think they each have unique peculiarities. So the international banks obviously are represented independently because they have to adhere to a group-wide commitment to the code, and whatever principles or proportionalities applied there, but at the same time need to adhere to the local market, for example.
Yeah, thanks, many thanks, Richard. And another question, which is an interesting one, actually. I don't know, maybe if we can comment from an SIFMA point of view, David, but FX Global Code, is it picking up on cryptocurrencies? Now, I think now the point could be to consider crypto as a currency in concept, but so FX market. I don't know if any of David, you want to express your view from an SIFMA, or if the others want to join in?
Yes, so from the ACI FMA point of view, we are aware of the growth of cryptocurrencies and new technologies associated with them. So far, speaking to our members, we don't think the institutional uptake of trading cryptocurrencies in an over-the-counter wholesale market is really at critical mass yet. However, we have formed a crypto working group as a subcommittee of the Committee of Professionals, where we are canvassing views from a wide range of market participants. We hope to actually produce the white paper sort of on the law. and what we would need to sort of address that issue within some guidance of codes. There are already a number of codes published by the
yeah. I think the voice is going up and down, David. I wish participants got something. Let me get another one in the interest of time. There was another one on the process. What is the process on registering on global index of public registers? So let me take this one very, very quickly. The statement of commitment, once the organization, the market participant, has completed its activity, is a standard document that you can find on the FX Global Committee website. And actually the website and all relevant links should be available in the resources of this webinar. And through that, you use that standard commitment, which is a very simple one page, that you can send to one of the authorized public registers. And once those statements of commitment are published into the public register you have selected, CLS, for instance, is one of those, then they got automatically displayed in the global index of public register, which again you can find into the Global FX Committee website. So just type FX Global Code in Google and you will get access to the main website, or use icon to access the main pages. I think we have time for one last question. There was one question from a participant on the SARB, basically if they are registered already, if you have included. The question was, when will the South African Reserve Bank will submit request for inclusion in the participating public register? Andres, just to confirm, if I'm not wrong, the Reserve Bank, the South African Reserve Bank, is already displayed on the global index. Is that correct?
That is correct. We are already included in the global index.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, I think we overshoot it a little bit by a couple of minutes, and thanks to all of you for this. We will follow up with a couple of other questions we have received, but I would like to thank our speakers, Andreas, David, Jonathan, and Richard, for their precious contribution. As anticipated, both the deck and the recording will be circulated soon after the session. A big thank you goes to you, to all attendees. We really wish this Refinitiv webinar in partnership with the SIFMA has contributed to increase awareness on the code and how it can help to shape a better foreign exchange market going forward. With this in mind, I would like to thank you again for your attendance today and wish you a great day. Have a great day, everybody.